Have you ever wanted to dry age beef at home? I did it. I'm going to tell you what I learned.
So I wanted to find out, can you use a standard refrigerator to dry age meat? I wanted to know if you could use the one that opens up 37 times a day, the one you put your leftovers in, the one that your kids leave open all the time, without using one of the bags, without encasing it in butter, just a standard refrigerator, and that is exactly what I set out to do. Mrs. GTE asked me what I wanted for Christmas, and I told her that I wanted a square foot in the refrigerator for 28 days with no complaining, and she agreed. So with that, we were off to the races. And this video is not meant to be a how-to. I just compiled a lot of the information I got from a lot of different videos. I'm taking you along with the adventure to answer two questions. Can you dry age meat in a standard fridge? And is it worth it?
I bought a standing rib roast on sale during the holidays with the intent to do this test. Now, it wasn't anything special, and the marbling wasn't great, but I thought it would be perfect. And for a fair comparison, I took off about 1/3 of the roast to save it for later. This would act as the control, so we were only testing the difference in the process. I put it in a vacuum bag and into the freezer for 28 days. I was curious how much weight the roast would lose, and so I weighed it, and it started out at 6 pounds, 13 ounces. Most people suggest using a cooling rack to keep the airflow around the meat and to put down a layer of salt to act as a desiccant as the meat dries. Then I put the rib roast bone side down and put it in the fridge for 28 days.
So one important thing to note is food safety and temperature. I made sure that I put the meat in the coldest spot in my fridge and it stayed a constant 35 or 36 degrees throughout the entire time. If it was higher than that, or if you put it in a warm spot in the fridge, you're probably going to end up getting sick, so be safe.
After 6 days, the roast had just started to show the signs of drying and we lost 1/4 pound. At 8 days, I noticed that the cap was drying out, but the center on the side was still wet. I was a little concerned since the rest of the meat had formed a really nice pellicle except for that part. So I bought a cheap USB-powered fan for some extra airflow. I just used a battery pack and let it run for a few hours over the next couple of days. That instantly made a difference and the roast sealed itself up. At day 20, you could really tell that the meat was coming along and shrinking in size. It lost a full pound and was pretty hard on the outside. At long last, the joyous day 28 had arrived. This roast did not look like something anyone would want to eat. There's no mold or off smells, so I figured we were good to go. I left the butcher's string on to keep the bones stuck to the roast, but now it was time to remove them. They helped protect the bottom and had no usable meat whatsoever. Cutting through the pellicle was a bit harder than I anticipated, and I didn't know what I would find underneath. Imagine my surprise when I found the dark purple meat that looked and smelled just like a good elk steak. The differences between the freezer-aged steak and the dry-aged steak were enormous in size, smell, and color. The next step was to portion the roast into steak-sized pieces, which was easy to do once you got through the pellicle. Now, Chef John kept the rind on the meat, but everyone else I saw removed it, and I can't imagine why you would want to leave it on the steak. As I removed the rind, the steaks had shrunk to be about the size of a New York strip, but looked absolutely amazing. The freezer-aged steaks were nearly falling apart after being thawed and were much softer to the touch. And to keep things consistent, I didn't use any fancy rubs, and I kept it all easy with just salt and pepper to season the steaks. Reverse searing your steak is a great way to get the smoke flavor into the meat and then sear it for the crust you crave. I set the Kamado for 225 degrees Fahrenheit and put the freezer steaks on first since they were a little bit thicker and would take longer to cook. Just don't forget to flip them so they cook evenly. And that is when the dry-aged steaks join the party. 28 days of waiting all came down to this. Of course, you know what's coming next. I seared 2 steaks at a time for a minute or 2 per side to get a good crust, and I alternated between the 2 sets of steaks. I let them cook until they reached 125 degrees internal temperature, which will end up being medium rare once it rests. I don't know about you, but I could watch this all day. After a quick rest, I started slicing them up for me and some guests. I wanted them to try each one and tell me which one they liked best, and I refused to tell them what the difference was until after they voted. Now, if you've ever wondered why I always do voiceovers inside, here's a clue.
Can I have some of that?
Yeah, bite.
And just like that, they cast their votes.
So the votes are in, and everybody liked the freezer steak better than dry age. I was completely blown away. Of course, I liked the dry age one better, but that's because I knew about the effort and everything that I had done when I put into it. The other people had no clue which one was which. Now, people went nuts in every video that I watched, and I was completely surprised. I expected a bigger difference in flavor than what we got. The dry age beef had a stronger beef flavor, but those differences were pretty slight. The biggest differences were tenderness, and everybody agreed that the dry-aged steak was way more tender than the one that was stored in the freezer. I thought about it for a bit, and I wondered if the way that I cooked it over an open fire had masked the natural flavors of the beef, and so I decided to cook it up in the cast iron pan, and the smell was absolutely super intense, beefy flavor, and the steak was just okay. So now I really need to go find a real dry-aged steak and compare it to what I came up with. I'm pretty sure that I didn't do everything right. The environmental conditions were probably not perfect. At least the humidity was lower than it probably should have been. So I got to find out what a real dry-aged steak tastes like. So can you dry-age beef in a regular refrigerator? Well, of course I did, but the results, they were not spectacular. I could have spent a little bit more money and got a better steak and gotten that same tenderness. I could have gotten it today instead of waiting a month and leaving it in the fridge. A lot less work for about the same result. So you seem like the kind of person that loves to cure meat, and I've got a playlist for you right over here. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so that way you can see more tests just like the one that we did.